Welcome back to another episode of Adventures in Machine Learning. I'm one of your hosts, Michael Burke, and I do data engineering and machine learning at Databricks. I'm joined by my beautiful co-host,
Ben Wilson. I resolve merge conflicts before release at Databricks.
Today we are speaking with Görkem. He started his career at Nokia, where he quickly became a principal engineer. He then moved to Red Hat and became a distinguished engineer. He's basically held every title like prefix for engineer, so just check out the LinkedIn. It's pretty cool. He's played a large role at the Eclipse Foundation, contributing to their web, mobile, and Java development tools. And just to add another open source example, he's built the Java and YAML extensions for VS Code. Currently, he's working as CTO and distinguished engineer at Jozu, an ML ops framework focused on bridging the notebook-based ML production gap that is often very hard to bridge. So, Görkem, you've contributed to many amazing OSS projects. Do you have a favorite?
Do I have? That's an interesting question. I don't think I do have a favorite, in the sense that all the projects that I have contributed to have been, to a degree, a developer tool. But if I have to choose the one that I had most fun was, we did a now archived open source project back in Nokia days called ESWT. It was a mobile version of the Eclipse's SWT UI toolkit. And I think that was most fun I had, because it was cross-platform. It was, if anyone remembers that, the Symbian operating system for Nokia phones, it was, we were building on Symbian, and then we were building on Linux, mobile Linux as well. So that was really fun and very challenging. I kind of learned a lot while building that, but it turned out to be nothing at the end of the day. So I guess the one that I had most fun is the one that is the least successful at the end of the day.
Interesting. Do you think there's any causal relationship there?
No, not really. I mean, it's just sometimes the technology can be solid, but then the market moves away. But around the time that we did ESWT, iPhone came out, and then Android came out. So the market turned into a completely different place. So I don't think has anything to do with the project or the technology itself. It's just, if you don't have a good finance that is supporting your project, open source or even closed source, that's not going to go very far.
Right. And then why have you spent so much time in open source? What has attracted you to that style of software development?
Oh, that started when I was at the university, essentially. So one of the first things that I noticed when going through university was the best way for me to be better at what I'm doing is to learn from the open source projects. So I started reading a lot of code at the time, and you're like 2 years to 3 years into the university, some things, but you don't know that much. And I was reading code for, Apache Tomcat. It wasn't even called Tomcat at the time, and so on and so forth. With the grandeurs of being able to contribute back to those projects. But at that time, I wasn't able to do that. But I learned a lot by just reading the code. And it kind of introduced me into the culture of open source, and it did improve my coding skills a lot at the time. So just trying to fix a bug on Tomcat was a lot of fun. You learn a lot. At the end, you couldn't always succeed at doing what you're supposed to do, but the the challenge of trying to fix a bug on an open source project was enlightening, essentially. So I kind of caught the bug at that point because I wanted to learn and be better at coding. So, and it continued on from then on. It's like, and not all my day jobs had an open source component to it. Even when they didn't, I actually continued on doing open source at nights because once you get into that culture, I guess it just pulls you in and you like it. So right now, even at Jozu, which we are a very small startup, I or any of my co-founders cannot think of a way of doing things that is not open source way. Like our first reaction to what we see is, can we do this open source way? So,
do you think it changes proprietary development practices when you have people that have done open source contributions? Does it influence, from your perspective, the designs that you come up with? Whereas, when you're building something in open source, you're like, we have to make this work for a lot of use cases and things that we might not be thinking of right now. Whereas in proprietary, you can just sort of lock down functionality, hard code stuff. Have you noticed that? And has that made software that you work on in a proprietary environment better, do you think?
Yes, it does. It's a night and day kind of change. I have in my team, I have people from Red Hat that came with that open source background, and we do have people who came from more proprietary software background as well. It's a night and day difference where, as you said, like when you're doing open source, you're kind of forced to think more general problems, more integration problems, and sort of extensibility problems as well. With proprietary software, you can limit yourself to that whatever use case and the requirement is, and solve that use case and requirement solely without thinking the day 2 problem or the day 10 problem of someone will try to do something different with this software, right? So yes, there is definitely that as well, and also the communication is very different. When you are doing open source, you are the idea that you have to communicate what you are doing asynchronously to a bunch of people that you may or may not ever see is built into your thinking. Therefore, that's what you are doing. Even in a small company, that actually helps a lot because not everyone is going to be able to listen to you as you explain your code or something. So that asynchronous documentation of what you are doing, what your vision is with this code, where you are going with this, how to build it, right? Or how to test it. That sort of information that is coming in with the open source is actually helpful with proprietary software as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, actually. My team manages open source packages, and it's fundamentally changed the way that I approach building things because of exactly what you mentioned. It's like, hey, if you want to work with a bunch of people in the open source community, you need to be very clear about what the direction is and what the functionality needs to be, and also considering not going too far on the abstraction layer of saying, you don't want to get into that YAGNI area where it's like, well, it'd be nice to have this functionality. Like, nobody's ever going to use that. Let's not build that. But we need to make what we're building, developed in such a way that day, release day plus 10 or release day plus 12 months is not going to be a nightmare to integrate with later on.
Yeah, I mean, just to give an example, back in the day when we were doing the Eclipse IDE, one of the rules about APIs was you could request a new API from Eclipse to integrate with. but then there had to be two different clients for it, meaning that if you are Databricks and you're requesting that API, if someone else other than Databricks or someone else other than Michael also requests that same API and say that, hey, yeah, we do need that functionality so that we can integrate this and that and in such and such ways, then Eclipse would come up with an API set for it. And before that, they would like say, no, there isn't enough requests for this functionality at the moment. Because think of a project like Eclipse where everyone is trying to, integrate with that. That if you grow your API set very quickly and without actually proving that the API is actually needed and designed as intended to be used, it quickly becomes a bloated garbage of API sets, essentially.
Yep.
How do you prioritize what not to build specifically at Jozu?
Our first assumption is we don't need to build it. Like we just look at, like, if something comes up to us as a problem that we need to solve with software, right? So our first assumption is we probably don't need to build this. There is probably a solution out there that we can contribute to or use or integrate that solves this problem. That's our first approach. So, and if we can find an open source alternative, a standard alternative to the problem, that we try to solve it that way. And if we can't, at that point, we actually start to build our own solution. And at some point during that build, we decide whether this makes sense to open source or not.
Got it. How do you leverage customer demand? So for instance, with Eclipse, they could actually submit a request for an API.
Yeah.
Do you guys think that's a good model? Do you do your own research? Do you have product managers that just deep dive with customers? How do you find out what is actually a useful feature?
We do have, at this stage, we do have design partners at Jozu, which we talk with a frequency and get feedback from them on how they use the open source project, GitHub's open source project, or the Jozu products, and then get that direct feedback into the projects. We do have people who have been making requests at the open source project, because that's the other thing about open source projects. You have a community that you can more or less directly communicate with. So we were getting feedbacks from there as well. So I think the direct feedback is very important, and the fact that we are able to get that direct feedback directly into the software team is, I think, has been valuable to us so far. But as things grow, I think it's going to be a bit less effective, because you can do this with a limited number of design partners. But if you have a lot of users, then you can't get feedback from 100 different companies at the same time, which is when you get a product manager, I suppose.
Or a whole team of them when you have thousands.
I already have a team of them, exactly.
Thousands of users. Yeah. Those are good problems to have, though.
I think so, yeah. I think so, yeah. I mean, on the open source side, it's always direct, and you have to, there was a term that was used, and I, to be honest, I haven't heard it lately, but there was always this benevolent dictator on an open source project, which kind of decides on the on the direction. I guess that if the project is at that size and at that state, you kind of need that as well. I'm not saying that it needs to be one person, but the project needs to have a vision.
Yeah.
Yeah. At some point, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, because I was going to ask you that. The difference between a benevolent dictator and a benevolent Senate that has quorum voting. What do you think is more effective for maintaining quality control and the prevention of the extreme uncontrollable expansion of functionality and just sheer number of APIs? Which one is more effective between the two of those?
Unfortunately, the dictator, the person, is more effective. Like, if someone has the last say, they are like, I don't know if people talk about the founders mode or something like that. One of the things about the founders mode is because they created the company, they won't have any problems making changes, right? Or rejecting changes, for that matter. I think it's a similar situation with an open source project as well. It's if you have people who have been like creators of a project, they will have less problems with accepting or rejecting changes to the project. And unfortunately, that also comes with a different set of problems. But from just to address the problem that you're saying, or the issues that you're saying, if you want someone who is effectively able to filter the noise about new features and APIs, then I think the benevolent dictator actually works better, as long as the person is the right person for doing that. I have seen very successful uses of the Senate as well, as you call it, a committee group or something like that, a project lead committee. It takes a lot of discussion, but at the end, it can reach to, with the right group of people, it can reach to very, very good results as well. So it kind of depends on how fast you are willing to move as well. With the Senate approach, there's always a discussion that needs to happen, especially for the large enough items. But with the benevolent dictator, it's one email and that's it.
But for any sufficiently complex project, like you've worked on some pretty big ones. There comes a point where a benevolent dictator is not going to be able to maintain context on everything.
No.
So what do you find is the most effective delegation tool or rule set to follow for management of super complex, very in high demand open source projects?
Modularization, right? It's like, so if you have a functionality that is large enough, and then you can divide that into modules and then establish the rules between modules, then you are able to, at that point, maintain each module as its own thing. Think of it this way. You have, let's take Eclipse IDE as an example. You have Eclipse IDE, which has, let's say, a Explorer view, which is one module, and then editor view, which is another module, right? The needs of the Explorer view and the editor view are very different, and they can be managed by different people, different committees, different rules. But then the way that they interact with each other can be a standard. Like, you can add another module, and the interaction is the rules of interaction is very well established. So one of the things that I like in such large systems is if you can actually treat everything as a plugin. Like, you have a very small kernel core, but then everything else is just a plugin to it. Like you're building the core, and then the file system is a plugin, and then you can just plug out the file system and come up with another file system, if you will. You'll probably never do that, but you will. You can think of it that way. And then if your editor is a plugin, and so on and so forth, and all plugins are equal, so that your ways of extending and interacting with the system is same for everyone, and nobody has privileges at that point. I think if you can come up with a system that works that way, then you are able to delegate the management of these modules to wherever. Like, they don't even need to be under the same open source project. They could be somewhere else and come in and be part of the system. I guess at that point, system kind of dictates how the management happens. Yeah, I mean, it's how you design a large system, right? If you there's always going to be, whether it's in the software side or the governance side of the system, problems that you're gonna have to overcome or face. So a modular design that is equally modular for everyone has always advantages from my experience.
Right. All right, Ben, zinger of a question. Do you mind giving a concise overview of MLflow's architecture and design principles?
Concise? I don't know about that. But from its very early days, like pre 1.0, the desire was to create a solution for not just the immediate need of what the initial design was, and in non-abstract terms, that is, okay, we know that we need to perform functions X, Y, and Z on, and within that functionality of X, we need X prime, as well. So we need the ability to store data somewhere in order to make the functionality work. Well, if you just do a single implementation of that, say like, okay, we need to log, runs and the data associated with runs. Well, where do we put that? Well, in the initial prototype, file store, right? Just local storage. Now, if you built that in at the beginning to just be that one single implementation, when you now need to think about, well, I need to store this on RDBMS, do I now have to go and refactor that or create this whole new implementation that allows for that? Or from the beginning, do I just create an abstraction that says this service interfaces with this abstraction? I don't care where this thing goes. I just know that I have a contract of functionality that needs to happen. And then I can externalize the processing of that in a number of effectively plugins. So it's just, how many tracking stores do we have now? Like, there's a lot. So each of those just has to agree to adhere to the contract that's established for functionality that it needs. And we handle that through registries. Those aren't really exposed to the user per se, but from a code-based perspective, we can externalize all that stuff. That same approach for handling just storage of data, which is the core tenet of MLflow, like what it does, stores data for you. That's been a sort of pattern for almost everything that's built. Is every major service is at its core is a factory. It's like, hey, I have this registry and I define what type of configuration I have, of what I want to use when I start this service. And then you can plug in anything you want. You can write your own, backend service abstraction or service layer and install it with MLflow. And all of a sudden you can write it to a database that we don't support. In fact, there's tons of plugins that people have done like that. And same thing with model registries and the artifact store. You can store it on, you name a cloud or on-prem solution, or, people have made plugins for like fairly archaic storage platforms. A couple of years ago, somebody was like, I need to support SFTP. Can we get that? And we're like, no, but you can do a plugin for that. And here's how to do it. And they just went off and built it. And then they merged it in later on. So yeah, like that architecture allows you to expand the functionality, the maintainability, the extensibility of your project, but also encourages more people to contribute to it because they can see like, oh, I can get this working from my use case. And it's simple to externalize this in such a way that makes it more testable and doesn't pollute the core functionality of the tool.
Got it. What are
that
the
was
downsides?
Not concise. I'm sorry.
It's pretty good. What are the downsides of this design, though? Or is it just perfect?
Nothing's perfect. What's really annoying is when you add a new feature to the abstraction layer and you're supporting 37 different implementations of that abstraction. You now have to add that in 37 locations. That sucks, but I think it's a positive trade-off. Because of the expanded usability of your framework, your tool that you're building, if you're supporting that many open source users that are using these 37 different implementations, taking the time to just do all of those updates to all of those things and then write all the tests to validate for functionality and all of those, it benefits the community. And sometimes the original contributors to a particular modular plugin, they'll volunteer like, oh, I'll do that for this one that I built. And we're like, awesome, great, thanks. That saves us like a couple days.
Got it.
I think it fosters a better community.
And one more question on this. When you're adding a new core thing, like a tracking server, I know that doesn't happen often, but like when you're adding a new abstraction layer, do you think benevolent dictator or benevolent senate is a better way to design it?
Görkem, you want to take that one first?
So we're talking about extending the core, a new abstraction is that core is aware of, right? Yeah, I would say a Senate because, and by Senate, I don't mean that whether we accept it or not, but I do believe that if you're coming up with a new abstraction, there should be more than one user for it. Like, you cannot really design a system, an extensible system, and be successful if you are designing it for just one person or one tool. That's not really abstraction. That's custom built essentially for that. So I'd prefer if there is a committee that is designing the solution, just because it just makes the design better.
Yeah, on our side of the house, Michael, we do that every once in a while. It's not frequent because it's a big thing to go down a road to do, but the successful things that have persisted in MOflow over the years that are new levels of abstraction that we've built, this major function, like core functionality, we bring in people for internal review. Like the maintainers will design something, but we need a lot of differing opinions from a lot of different people to do that, that architectural review. And a lot of people who are they haven't committed a single line of code to MOflow, but they have 25 years experience in software engineering, and they come from a different side of the house that's dealing with, services and code bases that we don't have experience with. So we're getting that benefit of their perspective to look at what we're trying to do. And they ask a lot of pointed questions. And these questions are coming from a place of ignorance about the project, but wisdom about the craft. So they'll look at it and be like, are you sure you need this? Or could you maybe think about it in this way? And sometimes that feedback, we can be like, we actually don't need an abstraction here because we're never going to extend this, or it doesn't make sense to extend it. Let's just do the implementation the fast way. And every so often we get the other side of the house where we're like, oh, we want to build this functionality, and then somebody will be like, what about this? Like, my team could use this later. In fact, we have a project next quarter that could use this. Could you just abstract this? And we're like, sure, okay.
Got it.
So yeah, the committee, like expanding that committee to a lot of people, you're always going to get better results, in my opinion.
Gorkem, question. Or go ahead.
There's an adverse effect too. Like if you're a like ML flow, I'm sure there are parts of modules that they just want to be part of ML flow because they think that it's going to give their whatever solution is more exposure.
Oh yeah.
So they want like, yeah, let me just put that into ML flow as well because it's going to make it, like any open source or any platform that is successful faces that problem of, yeah, let's put this as well. Well, this is not that sort of platform. I don't know if putting that here makes any sense, but people think that having that exposure is good for their product, whatever that they are trying to build.
Yes, we have denied many feature requests like that. It's not so frequent these days, but a couple of years ago, it was pretty common. Sometimes somebody would just file a PR out of the void, and you look at it, and you're like, all right, there's like 10,000 lines of code here. Let me look through what this is. And you're like, no, we're not going to merge this. Like, this is your company's proprietary product. Like, I get what you're trying to do here, but no. Here's a plugin that you can use, and you can put this in your code base and have your users install this, and then you get the functionality. But this optically, this is not good for the open source project. Like, we don't even really do that, and we have our own version of MLflow for Databricks. That's completely separate. It's a separate implementation, separate repository. It uses the same UI, same client APIs, but we have that modular separation between the clients that users are using and the backend implementation is completely separate.
Gorkem, I'm curious from your perspective, is it a good idea to maintain these edge versions in your proprietary stack and then an open source version as well? Or should you just have two separate products? Or is there a time and a place?
Yeah, I don't. Okay, this is not going well. I don't believe in having two versions of it. Like, I think the open source project should be. There is an open core model. At the end of the day, the open source project needs to have some sort of economics that is tied to it, right? So, and the open core model, for instance, you can have the core that is coming from open source project, and if the system is modular enough, you can actually build your own that includes your own proprietary modules that is tied to your product, and that's essentially fine. Or you can even go to Red Hat model where it's actually building just the open source project, but it is coming from Red Hat and supported by Red Hat, right? So there's that model as well. It's essentially not exactly, but very, very close to what you would get from upstream, but you're getting the open source bets, almost the same bets. So, like, there are things like that, but I don't think that diverging the code base between product and the open source project is good for the open source project. Like, at the end of the day, the major contributor of the open source project, if they are the major contributor to the product, one of them is going to be neglected in one way or the other, right? So, that's my preference, and I have not been able to work in an environment where there was this a distinction, and you could achieve same amount of attention to both the open source code base and the product code base.
Is there a way to do it if there's two separate teams that do it with different missions?
To be honest, I have never worked in a company that is that rich. But it's like, let's build this solution 2 times. But if again, it becomes like, can you actually align them so that the abstractions are that solid and you have enough? At that point, you're basically building a kit, a test kit that approves or verifies that not only the API abstraction, the API contract is the same, but also the behavior is the same. Because there's always behavioral changes, even though the APIs are the same, the behavior may be different, right? So you're basically building a test kit for that as well, just to make sure that what you're building as part of the product and what you're building as part of the open source project matches 99%. So it's tough, to be honest. That's a very tough decision. There may be reasons that I am not seeing for doing that, and I have been in a project like that before. So and we had our reasons for it. Our reason was it was hardware bound project, so that hardware was not available to open source project. So we had to implement it on a software abstraction and then implement it internally on top of the hardware abstraction. So, but other than, and even in that case, we were like, yeah, this is open source, but it's 2 code bases.
Yeah, can confirm it is challenging to do that on our side.
Yeah.
And ours is more data volume, like why we have to do it. And, if you're a user who's just downloading this package and installing it for your own single company, you might have, 10 users, or you might have 100, or you might have 1,000 for our deployments that we have in order to make it economically viable to even just run this service. We have to merge a bunch of things together in like a cloud region zone.
Yeah.
And then at that point, the open source implementation, like a standard, single RDBMS instance is not going to support that number of events that's happening. And building a robust REST interface is kind of overkill to do that in the open source version of it, because nobody's ever going to need that. And people aren't going to want to download that, install it, and go through the complexity of installing all of these services. You can't get started quick with that. It's like, oh, do you have 3 weeks to set this up and set up all your cloud infrastructure to do it? So that's why there's a difference between the two. But I think it's really important, and I 100% agree with you on, you can't neglect that open source version of it. And I'm not a huge fan of that core model at all. Yeah. Where it's like, yeah, here's something you can build off of. If you look at most of those projects, they're not super successful. Like, they might have a bunch of stars or something because people were excited at some point. But when you look at the downloads of them and the actual usage, who's talking about them, nobody does anything with them, because yeah, you're getting this interface. You're basically downloading an API contract that you now have to build an entire implementation for.
Yeah.
It's much better if you're downloading something that just works and solves the problem. And the key is, not neglecting that functionality and making sure that, hey, that open source version, it had better work. And, it had better be a rich experience for the targeted demographic of users. Just like, hey, I just want to run this at my company. I don't need to buy a service to do this. This is free. And it helps me out in the process of building AI solutions. Yeah, That's what our team is dedicated to, is like, let's help those people out and make it so that they have something that's useful.
And that's like, for instance, we actually went through a process like that where recently we just released Jozu Hub we just opened it up to public. And one of the things that we did when we were building Jozu Hub was, should we actually open source this or not? But it's a SaaS service. If we open source it, it means that we need to say that, hey, you know what, in order to, just give this a try on the open source project, you need to build this containers and that services, and then have them running together, and then coordinate that, apply this Terraform and this. And it's like, I have worked on projects like that as well, and they never get contributors. Like, they don't get the contributor attention because nobody wants to go through that pain of putting something up so that they can start testing it, right? So we decided not to open source the Jozu Hub at that point, because we didn't believe that there would be any community benefits to it. If someone can convince me that there are community benefits to it, we'll consider that. But at the moment, I don't see it. But on the GitHub side, where we came up with the Git CLI and so on and so forth, today Git CLI is like Git checkout, go run, and you're testing the latest code. So, when things are that easy, you actually have community benefits. People can get into the project very quickly and see the benefits very quickly as well. So, that is one of those things where you don't see too many SaaS open source projects that are, getting a lot of outside contributors other than the core team that actually started the project.
Yeah, exactly. That just made me, gave me not so much a flashback, but I was just imagining what it would be like to open source the actual implementation that we have for the back end of MLflow. And how many people would need to be involved in setting that up? Because there's considerations for, a managed service where you have customers that are paying you to do this thing. Well, you have to think about stuff like EU regulations. So GDPR, somebody generates data that has something to do with them, that there's an identifying set of characteristics in there. Well, you need to be able to purge that data by international law. Yeah. Well, do we do that in the open source? Well, that's another service that needs to run, and as part of your open source deployment. So there's a VM that needs to run and needs to be running this, series of scripts that are doing this thing. And then your database layout, okay, for full scalability, you need to deploy Kubernetes and run all of these things on pods and have auto-scaling storage and have other considerations about what happens when the indexes need to be rebuilt. So you now are stacking all of these services up and up on top of this open source package. I can't even imagine what a getting started guide would be like for that. And then people are like, well, just do it all in containers. I'm like, well, you can't run all this stuff in containers. So some of this is manual to set it up for the first time. And yeah, when you have that much complexity to get started, I think it would just be amusing for somebody to do that kind of as a joke.
Yeah, usually the first thing that I have seen that people hit is authentication and authorization, right? We do have solutions like OIDC and so on and so forth, but at that point, everyone's authentication and authorization is different.
Yes.
Right. And now you're starting from that. Everything else you said, like the GDPR, that's a big service data governance rules as well. It's and all the isolations that you have to put into place and so on. So it just makes the the SaaS service so complicated, right? That trying to give someone a getting started becomes an issue, essentially.
Yeah, and if you extend out the ability to open source a lot of those back-end abstractions, which for SaaS, you're not necessarily going to do that. You're not going to be like, well, we need to support lineage tracking for all the data that's generated. As a SaaS service, you're going to build integration into your lineage tracker. But if you're like, well, we need to make a plugin approach for this internally, nobody's going to approve that, because you're like, well, why would we need to do that? That would introduce so much more complication and code complexity. So let's not do that. But when you open source it, you would have to build that interface.
Yeah.
And then you would have to document like how to integrate with that. I think from a sheer documentation perspective, doing like a full export of a SaaS service to open source is just untenable. Like,
and then, and also you need like a SaaS gets very, very complicated very easily, right? It's like as I said, once you put in data sovereignty into the picture, it becomes a completely different beast, or some other concern like that. And that concern on an open source project is not there, right? That's right. Like if you're giving a package on an open source project that actually solves the data sovereignty problem and the GDPR problem and all those problems, I don't think that the getting started for that is not followable. No one can follow that, right? It's and it becomes an overly complex thing that nobody other than the core team is able to follow.
Exactly. And even then, there's probably not even one person on the core team that understands all of it.
No.
Like, there's no way. Like, I don't know, how many teams do we have dealing with our back end? 7 for just the actual code, and then services, 12 different teams, each with 8 to 15 engineers. You know, it becomes such a beast of complexity when you're talking about that.
Görkem, I have a question for you. So you get to sort of play conductor as CTO. You get to start with the design, figure out how things should be built, figure out how things should be decided. Have you enjoyed that process? I know you've done a lot of projects, but you get to sort of start from scratch.
I think when you're senior enough as an engineer, you get to be able to do that in other companies as well. But yeah, I have always enjoyed that process of, let's start something new or something additional on this, and let's, if it is large enough, let's pull in enough teams or enough people to this, or if it is not large enough, sometimes it's there are projects that I just started over the weekend that grew into something else. At some point, it's just, code is just there to show the vision. And I always joke about it. It's like when I introduce this to engineers, I say, I wrote some code, now shows how it works. Now make it good. Because, it's just a code that I have. It's a different way of explaining your vision. At that point, it's like, oh, this is how I see this happening. And then you explain that and see if the engineering team actually is able to internalize it and help them internalize it, and then they can take the project to the next level. And at some point it becomes you work either part of that project as any other engineer, or you kind of coach the team to the vision as well, where it needs to go, and then coordinate with the rest of the company, because no project is successful without enough marketing, enough product product management, program management, enough customer interaction. So
do you still file PRs?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Oh yeah. More than ever. Yeah.
So what's the size of the engineering organization that you will no longer be filing PRs against company repositories?
I can't imagine a size. Like I will probably continue to do that. I can't really imagine a size where I won't be checking out code and doing something with the code. Or sometimes it's easy to explain a vision or a feature in words, but sometimes it's just easier to express that in code, right? When someone sees actually something working and how badly written or how easily broken that is, like it gives them a better idea of where this needs to go. So I can't imagine myself giving up on that. It becomes a different challenge because your schedule is filled with things that do not allow you to spend enough time on a code base. But that's a different. And also sometimes you actually annoy your engineers by sending PRs that are completely off where the code base is. It's like, yeah, I guess you need to rewrite that. Well, and that's the other thing. I like to work with engineers who will tell me that if I am being ridiculous with that code. So I do work with those sort of people now. So it's like, yeah, you've written this, but I don't know what you were thinking. Is a very common pull request review that I get. So, like you started the code base or you were part of the code base actively 6 months ago, but code bases don't stay the same.
So in your history of working at companies, I'm sure you've worked for people in your current position that come from one of two sides of the house: the actual builder, which would be you, who's like still actively involved in like what is engineering actually building, and is it like I want to collaborate with them and try to come up with new ideas and new implementations. And I'm sure you've worked for CTOs that come more from the executive side, which is they have an engineering degree from like 30 years ago and they stopped coding 28 years ago. Which one do you feel like or should say, which type of engineer do you look for in hiring? Like what their opinion is of a better CTO? Like, do you seek out the people that want to collaborate with top C-suite technical people, or people that are comfortable with the business side of executive leadership?
Yeah, you mean like if with the engineering team that we are hiring, or is it which one I would prefer?
Mm-hmm.
Which one? If I would say the engineering team that I'm hiring should be comfortable with working with anyone, regardless of their title in the company, and they should be able to say what they need to say to that person, respectfully, obviously, because I wouldn't mind if someone comes to me and says, well, your code is just not good, right?
Just not good.
Yeah, it's like I wouldn't mind hearing that, or I'm not claiming to be up to date with every code base that we have as well. So that's just normal. What wouldn't be normal is if someone is holding back because it's coming from a C-level or a VP level person. So I don't think that's right, and I encourage people to actually have different opinions or opposing opinions and be able to express that. That's how we grow. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to grow, right? So, and for people who I'd like to work with on the C level or VP levels and others, the executive levels, I would prefer people who encourage an open discussion as well. And everyone should understand that at the end of the day, there will be a discussion, and if you don't agree, you don't agree. But someone who has the responsibility makes the decision. So you will have to commit to that decision, but at least you will have your opinions heard and given a thought. I think that's the right way to do it.
So I take it you really enjoyed your time working for people that are like you, and myself personally, I also love that. Like when you have a CTO who knows how to code and is still coding like every day at least, and they can have that conversation because they might not have all the context that your immediate project is working on. You don't need that either. You just need that wisdom and like somebody who's been there, done that many, many times and has seen all sorts of stuff to come in and be able to understand everything that's being said in that meeting room or that discussion and contribute. Sometimes even examples of like, hey, we're not speaking the same language. Give me 2 hours. I'll send you some code and then we'll be on the same page. And when you get that response, you're like, man, I love this place. This place is awesome. Because you can have that back and forth with somebody who's technical and, that code you get from them might not be, the standards of what your project is right now. It doesn't need to be. It's just that you're now speaking the same language that the team is speaking. So everybody can understand very quickly what the idea here is. And from my own experience working at companies where the CTO is so checked out of the tech world that it doesn't matter if you're explaining it to the CEO, the COO, or the CTO, it's the same conversation that you have to have with all three of them because they're all equally ignorant of like what your team is doing or how it operates. I find that very frustrating and stifling for an organization when the person in that role is just not effectively qualified for it.
It's just, I sometimes joke about it. It's like they're running a tech company this month and they're going to run a automotive company next month, kind of executives that they are tough to work with.
Well, I'm glad that I'm low enough that I don't have to deal with any of this politics. I can just type on my computer, put on headphones, call it a day.
Well, at some point in the future, Michael, you'll be at a level where you'll be in the room with the CTO discussing something. And if they come from a tech background, you'll realize that the result and the efficiency of that meeting for a half an hour, you'll get everything discussed that needs to be discussed. And you have, a vision forward that's probably going to work out really well, or it's going to fail really fast. And then you'll have a bunch of alternatives to explore. And you're going to have mutual respect with that person. And it's super powerful versus having that same discussion with somebody who doesn't have that background is a 4-hour meeting. And the only result of that 4-hour meeting is confusion on both sides or frustration on both sides.
No, I'm aware. I'm in a project right now where we have, let me make sure I'm abstracting the details enough. Where we have basically two leaders. One is a tech leader and one is a tech in quotes leader. And 2 hours of the actual tech leader's time has been more valuable than 6 weeks of the non-tech leader's time. Because it's just, these are the 7 things. This is what you should do. I will follow up on 3 of them. Done. So from an external perspective, I can definitely appreciate. Well, anyway, I think we're about at time. Let me quickly summarize. Open source software, you have to think a lot more into the future than with proprietary code. Choosing what to build, the default should be not to build it, because we all have important lives where we want to not be working all the time, and we need to prioritize. And a way to do that is getting direct feedback from customers, specifically design partners that you can have open dialogues with. Both the benevolent dictator and the benevolent Senate models can work, but they both have their pros and cons. And then finally, don't include any open source and proprietary version of the same project. Try to conglomerate them into one project instead of creating two separate teams. But as we talked about today, it might be hardware, it might be just scale. You sometimes have to split out these projects. So Görkem, if people want to learn more about you or Jozu, where should they go?
Jozu is on jozu.com. So we have just released our hub, which is an experience on OCI registries for model kits. Model kits are our OCI artifact format for storing AI ML artifacts. And if you want to learn more about the open source project, where the model kits are coming from and the CLI is hosted, it's kitops.ml. And you can find me as Görkem Erkan on Twitter as well. And LinkedIn. I'm sure there aren't too many Görkem Erkans on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I definitely learned a lot. And until next time, it's been Michael Burke and my co-host,
Ben Wilson.
And have a good day, everyone.
We'll catch you next time.